Hello and welcome to Indus News from Islamabad. I am Aneeb Hamid and these are the headlines. In Pakistan, security forces have killed a terrorist commander, Ehsanullah alias Ehsan Sunray, along with his 3 accomplices in Khyber Pakhtunkhwa. In a tweet, the military's media wing said Sunray was involved in a recent terrorist attack near North Waziristan, which led to the martyrdom of several soldiers and officers, including Lieutenant Nasir and Captain Sabir. It says Sunray was also responsible for over 30 terrorist attacks against security forces. Pakistan has summoned a senior Indian diplomat to lodge a strong protest over the latest ceasefire violations along the line of control. The Foreign Office says an 11-year-old girl was martyred and 4 other civilians wounded in unprovoked Indian firing. Earlier, the Pakistan's military media wing said Indian forces targeted civilian population with heavy mortars in Hot Spring and Rakchikri sectors, which was responded to effectively. The chairman of Afghanistan's High Council for National Reconciliation, Abdullah says he agrees with the Taliban that there should be no foreigners in the room during intra-Afghan negotiations. However, he said foreigners' assistance would possibly be needed at a later stage. At a press conference in Doha, Abdullah said he's sure both sides will discuss a ceasefire negotiations, proposing a reduction in violence initially. In Belarus, police have detained around 250 protesters as 100,000 rallied against President Alexander Lukashenko in Minsk. Protesters are demanding the release of a jailed opposition leader, Maria Kolesnikova. Unrest in Belarus was triggered last month by an election believed to have been rigged in favor of Lukashenko. In India, the number of coronavirus cases has topped 4.7 million, with over 94,000 infections and 1,114 deaths overnight. In Pakistan, 6 people lost their lives to the virus overnight, taking the tally to 6,379, with over 301,000 infections. Globally, the virus has claimed over 920,000 lives and infected more than 28.7 million people so far. More news stories coming up in this bulletin after a short break. Stay tuned. Now, in Pakistan, security forces have killed a terrorist commander, Ehsanullah alias Ehsan Sunray, along with his 3 accomplices in Khyber Pakhtunkhwa. In a tweet, the military's media wing said Sunray was involved in a recent terrorist attack near North Waziristan, which led to the martyrdom of several soldiers and officers, including Lieutenant Nasir and Captain Sabir. It said Sunray was also responsible for over 30 terrorist attacks against security forces. Pakistan has summoned a senior Indian diplomat to lodge a strong protest over the latest ceasefire violations along the line of control. In a statement, the Foreign Office said an 11-year-old girl was martyred and 4 other civilians wounded in unprovoked Indian firing. Spokesperson Zahid Hafiz said the Indian troops are continuously targeting civilian population with heavy weaponry. Chaudhry said 18 civilians have been martyred and 176 were wounded in 2,225 ceasefire violations so far this year. He said New Delhi's senseless acts of aggression are in clear violation of the 2003 ceasefire understanding. Islamabad also urged New Delhi to allow the UN military observers to play their mandated role as per the Security Council resolutions. Earlier, the Pakistan military's media wing said Indian forces targeted civilian population with heavy mortars in Hot Spring and Rakchikri sectors, which was responded to effectively. Chairman of Afghanistan's High Council for National Reconciliation, Abdullah says he agrees with the Taliban that there should be no foreigners in the room during intra-Afghan negotiations. However, he said foreigners' assistance would be needed at a later stage. At a press conference in Doha, Abdullah said he is sure both sides will discuss ceasefire negotiations. Abdullah proposed initially there should be significant reduction in violence, then humanitarian ceasefire, and then a permanent ceasefire. He said negotiating teams agreed how to take talks from surface level to in-depth issues during the preliminary meeting yesterday. Abdullah said years-old problems cannot be resolved in 1 or 2 days. Meanwhile, Prime Minister Pakistan's Special Representative for Afghanistan, Mohammad Sadiq, has met with all stakeholders at the intra-Afghan negotiations in Doha. Sadiq says he had significantly useful discussions with the negotiators. Mohammad Sadiq met Chairman of Afghanistan's High Council for National Reconciliation, Abdullah. He also called on Kabul's chief negotiator to intra-Afghan negotiations, Mohammad Masoom Staniksai. The Prime Minister's representative also held a discussion with Mullah Abdul Ghani Baradar and other members of the Taliban's political commission. Taliban spokesperson Mohammad Naeem said these two sides discussed relevant issues in detail. Now moving to Bahrain, where protests have broken out against the government's normalization of diplomatic relations with Israel. Bahrain's top Shiite cleric rejected the deal and called on people to resist it. Demonstrators holding Palestine's flags came out against the government's intentions to open an Israeli embassy in Bahrain. The kingdom's former lawmaker Ali al-Aswad called it a black day in the history of Bahrain. Meanwhile, another Gulf nation, Oman, has welcomed Israel and Bahrain's decision. In a statement, the government said Oman hopes the new strategic path will bring peace and end the Israeli occupation of Palestinian lands. Meanwhile, in Israel, thousands of people have staged a protest outside Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu's residence in Jerusalem for the 12th consecutive week. They are calling for Netanyahu's resignation over allegations of corruption and his mishandling of the coronavirus pandemic. Police have made a few arrests, though protesters have been peaceful. The Prime Minister was indicted on charges of bribery, fraud and breach of trust in November last year. Now, the Saudi-led coalition fighting in Yemen says it has attacked Houthi positions in the capital, Sana'a. Saudi state media said fighter jets targeted barracks and military sites of the rebels. The state media said the coalition downed 4 explosive-laden Houthi drones at the Al-Delmi airbase north of Sana'a. A day earlier, the coalition launched 9 strikes on a military engineering camp and headquarters for Houthis. The number of such incidents has spiked after Saudi forces shot down multiple Houthi drones aiming at Riyadh last week. The Lebanese army has clashed with anti-government protesters as they marched towards the presidential palace in Babda city. The protesters chanted slogans against President Michel Aoun for his failure to control economic and political crisis. Soldiers fired rubber bullets at the demonstrators and live rounds in the air to disperse hundreds of protesters. Supporters of President Aoun called for a counter-protest at the same location, adding to the tension. The demonstrations have intensified after the massive explosion shattered Beirut, killing 200 people. Now, China has slammed a U.S. report accusing Beijing of expansionist military ambitions. In a statement, China's Defense Ministry spokesperson said Washington itself poses the biggest threat to global peace. The spokesperson called the U.S. Defense Department's report a malicious distortion of fact. It said for decades, Washington has violated international orders, stirred regional conflicts, and destroyed world peace. Beijing urged Washington to take concrete actions to safeguard the healthy development of bilateral military relations. This comes after Pentagon's report said China aims to use its military to revise aspects of international order. Moving on, Greece has welcomed the return of Turkish survey vessel Ork Reis back to its southern province of Antalya. Speaking to media, Prime Minister Kyriakos Mitsotakis called it a positive first step. He said Athens wants dialogue with Turkey, but in a climate without provocations. Mitsotakis said dialogue is the only way to tackle the issue of delimitation of maritime zones between the two countries. NATO allies Turkey and Greece have overlapping claims to continental shelves and rights to potential energy resources in the Mediterranean. Tensions flared last month after Ankara sent Oryx raids to map out oil and gas drilling prospects in waters claimed by Greece, Cyprus and Turkey. Meanwhile, in Russia, voters are casting their ballots in dozens of local elections that are seen as a big test for the ruling pro-Kremlin United Russia Party. Nearly 160,000 candidates are vying for seats in local parliaments. Governors are also being elected in many regions. The polls come only weeks after the suspected poisoning of opposition leader Alexei Navalny. His team alleged this was done on the orders of President Vladimir Putin. The Kremlin denies any involvement. In Belarus, police have detained around 250 protesters as thousands rallied against President Alexander Lukashenko in Minsk. Protesters are demanding the release of a jailed opposition leader, Maria Kolesnikova. She has emerged as a key opposition figure after others were either jailed or forced out of the country. Ahead of the protest, the Interior Ministry said additional forces were called to the streets of Minsk to prevent the holding of what it described as an unauthorized rally. Unrest in Belarus was triggered last month by an election believed to have been rigged in favor of Lukashenko. Under pressure, Lukashenko is due to visit Russia for talks with President Vladimir Putin tomorrow. Now, Mali's new military leaders have agreed to establishing an 18-month transition government until an election can take place. The announcement comes after 3 days talks between military, political leaders and civil society groups. Spokesperson Musa Kamara said the interim government will either be led by a military officer or a civilian. While military junta head Colonel Assimi Goita said they are committed to implementing all resolutions of the charter, including general elections. The opposition coalition has strongly rejected the idea of a military officer leading the transitory period. The US says Libya's renegade commander Khalifa Haftar has committed to ending a months-long blockade of oil facilities. Libya's oil production has plunged by around 3/4 since Haftar launched a blockade. In a statement, the US embassy in Libya said Haftar's forces had convened their commitment to allow the full reopening of the energy sector. Last week, the National Oil Corporation said total losses due to the blockade in the past 234 days have neared $9.5 billion. The blockade has also cut off revenue for state institutions operating across the country. The United States says it will continue to support the Sudanese people as flash floods continue to ravage the country. Secretary of State Mike Pompeo said he called Sudan's Premier Abdallah Hamdok to offer condolences for those who died in floods. Pompeo said the two sides discussed U.S. assistance for flood response. Over 100 people have died in floods that swamped more than 100,000 houses. Since July, 500 people have been injured due to flooding. On Thursday, authorities declared an economic emergency following a dramatic plunge in the value of the national currency. Now, in the United States, over 30 people have been killed by wildfires raging through Oregon, California, and Washington for the last 3 weeks. Officials said dozens of people are missing in Oregon, and the state should be prepared for a mass fatality incident. Tens of thousands of people have been displaced following the massive inferno. The blaze has burnt millions of acres and destroyed thousands of homes. In Oregon, firefighters are battling 16 large blazes with 40,000 people under mandatory evacuation orders. President Donald Trump will visit California on 14th of September to get a briefing on the latest situation. Now, 9 people have died after a landslide triggered by overnight rainfall swept through 3 Nepalese villages. Rescue officials say 22 missing people are believed to be still buried under the debris. The officials said they pulled out the bodies from underneath houses in eastern Sindhupalchok district with the help of the locals. Landslides are common in mountainous Nepal during the monsoon season that usually ends in September. The government data shows the number of rain-related deaths this year has reached 351, with 85 missing. More news coming up in this bulletin after a short break. Stay tuned. In India, the number of coronavirus cases has topped 4.7 million, with over 94,000 infections overnight. The country has registered 1,114 deaths in the past 24 hours, taking the toll to over 78,500. France has reported a record high number of single-day COVID-19 cases as more than 10,500 people tested positive. Globally, the virus has claimed over 920,000 lives and infected more than 28.7 million people so far. More details in this report.
Second wave of COVID-19 has started eroding all progress made by European countries in containing the virus in major countries like France, UK, Germany, Spain and Italy. In the US, the virus continues its aggressive spread in most of the states as President Donald Trump opposes restrictions. Down south, Latin American states are being devastated by the disease, where Brazil, Mexico and Colombia top the list.
Many families have lost loved ones. We have seen the economic and social devastation across the planet and also in our own territory. We had never thought about living through a situation like this, but we have seen in these months that as a country we have resilience, motivation and enthusiasm to move forward.
In a positive development, AstraZeneca has resumed British clinical trials of its COVID-19 vaccine after getting a green light from the safety watchdogs. Meanwhile, Australia has decided to extend restrictions on its COVID-19 hotspot state of Victoria.
Today, I can announce that we have extended the state of emergency and the state of disaster for a further 4 weeks. That underpins all the different rules. It underpins taking those safe and steady steps.
Decide today if it would extend stricter antivirus curbs in the greater Seoul area as number of infections drop. But in Wuhan, the place where it all started, domestic air travel has returned to pre-pandemic levels with 500 domestic flights.
Meanwhile, in Pakistan, 6 people have died of COVID-19 in the last 24 hours. The Health Ministry says the country's death toll has reached 6,379. The ministry said 526 people tested positive for the virus overnight. It said there are 5,673 active infections, while the total confirmed cases have crossed 301,000 mark. The ministry said over 289,000 people have recovered so far. Earlier, Federal Minister for Planning and Development Asad Umar said Pakistan will begin phase 3 trial of a Chinese vaccine in 10 days. The United Nations has stepped up efforts to combat COVID-19 among Syrian refugees in Jordanian camps after cluster outbreaks. UN High Commissioner for Refugees Representatives in Jordan, Dominic March, said 5 cases were reported in Zaatari and Al-Sarraq camps this week. March said the latest developments have been a worrying situation for all, especially for refugees. He said crowded spaces and cramped living conditions in these camps make social distancing extremely difficult. The agency said the patients' families have also been quarantined inside the camp. The infections in these camps that house around 120,000 Syrian refugees are the first since the cases were reported in the kingdom in March. UN Secretary-General Antonio Guterres has urged the European Union members to take in migrants stranded in Greece. The Moria camp on Lesbos Island that hosted almost 12,000 refugees burned to the ground earlier this week. In an interview, Guterres said the only solution to the migrant crisis in Moria camp is transferring them to multiple states. He said thousands of hopeless and destitute asylum seekers cannot be accommodated by Greece alone. The UN chief said the destruction of the camp is an immense tragedy as the refugees are now living in the open air in miserable conditions. Guterres welcomed 10 European Union states' initiatives to take in a total of 400 unaccompanied minors from Lesbos, but said much more needed to be done. Earlier, police fired tear gas shells at refugees protesting for shelter. Peru's ruling coalition has accused the opposition of trying to involve the military as President Martin Vizcarra faces impeachment. Prime Minister Walter Mato says the government will use all legal means to stop the impeachment process. Justice Minister Ana Nera said the bid to oust Vizcarra is affecting the ability of the executive branch to operate properly. Meanwhile, Congress leader Manuel Merino acknowledged he had contacted commanders but denied seeking military support for impeachment.
The call with Admiral Cedron was in the afternoon, when there was still no decision. I cannot be talking about impeachment when there was no motion yet submitted. My call was in the afternoon when we were in a spokesperson meeting when there was a crisis.
Well, the president is charged with moral incapacity over leaked audio tapes and alleged ties to a singer involved in a fraud case. Now, Japanese Chief Cabinet Secretary Yoshihide Suga says he will guard the economy after it got a blow from the pandemic. He made these remarks at a debate ahead of the ruling Liberal Democratic Party leadership election on Monday. Suga said he will use all means, including an additional economic package, to keep businesses going. He said there are complex issues between China, South Korea and other neighboring countries. The Cabinet Secretary said Tokyo needs to strategically form ties with these countries and communicate regularly. While rival candidate Shigeru Ishiba said the Bank of Japan should not make any immediate changes to its ultra-easy monetary policy. Suga is widely expected to become the Prime Minister next week after he secured the support of 5 major factions of the ruling party. A US movie, NOMADLAND, has won the Golden Lion Award on the last day of Venice Film Festival. The event's director Alberto Barbera says the festival met its goal of having about 50% of its usual public who came and won at the 77th Venice Film Festival strict protocols. Details in this report.
Only a few Hollywood celebrities made the trip to the world's oldest film festival, which is regarded as a showcase for Oscar contenders as the award season approaches. Many winners did not attend the ceremony, and those who did only took down their masks for the thank you speech. US-based Chinese director Chloe Zhao's Nomadland is a movie about a community of van dwellers traversing the vast American West. The Briton Vanessa Kirby won the Best Actress award for Pieces of a Woman, which shows the grief of a mother who lost her newborn daughter during a home birth.
We all experience grief in different ways, and we've all lost people. And I hope in some ways it unites us and makes us feel less alone, because you watch one woman's story of navigating that grief, which is an extremely individual, private, solitary journey. And I hope even in a tiny way it makes it more perhaps more less solitary, knowing that something's represented on the screen that might touch on what you feel.
The Best Actor's Prize, Italy's Pier Francesco Favino for Padre Nostro. Expressing his excitement, Favino urged his fans to be responsible and follow rules amid pandemic.
In recent years, the condition of our defense sector was one of de-investment after a period of very expensive and often not very targeted defense spending. The time to balance our needs and our capabilities has arrived. We must strengthen our armed forces for the safety of our country. It is our utmost duty towards the Greeks, who will bear the cost, the price of our place on the map.
Area of a major film festival happening live seemed almost unimaginable in the time of COVID-19. While many festivals went strictly online and Cannes was cancelled altogether, the Venice team deems the 10-day event a triumph against all odds.
More news coming up in this bulletin after a short break. Stay tuned. Now, in football, Granada beat Athletic Bilbao by 2-0 on the opening day of the Spanish La Liga season. Yangel Herrera put Granada ahead early in the second half with a glancing header before Luis Milla doubled their lead. Elsewhere, Cadiz's return to the top flight after 14 years was spoiled by a 2-0 defeat to Osasuna. Real Madrid, Barcelona and Atletico Madrid were among 6 sides who missed the opening weekend due to finished last season late. Meanwhile, in the English Premier League, defending champions Liverpool beat the returning Leeds 4-3 in a nail-biting contest at Anfield. Mohamed Salah scored a hat-trick, with 2 of his goals coming from penalties. Leeds dominated the majority of the game and came back thrice to make things difficult for the champions. Jack Harrison, Patrick Bamford and Matheus Kilic all scored for Leeds. In another fixture, Crystal Palace beat Southampton 1-0 at Selhurst Park Stadium, while Fred Zaha scored the only goal of the match. In the National Basketball Association, the Los Angeles Lakers beat Houston Rockets by 119 points to 96 in the playoffs at the NBA's Biosecure Bubble in Florida. The Lakers' win gave them an unassailable 4-1 lead in the 7-game Western Conference semi-final series. It's the Lakers' first trip to the Western Finals in 10 years, where they will meet either of the Los Angeles Clippers and the Denver Nuggets. Just like in the last round of the playoffs against the Portland Trail Blazers, Lakers dropped Game 1 before winning 4 in a row. Lakers point guard LeBron James bagged 29 points, 11 rebounds and 7 assists, while Kyle Kuzma chipped in with scoring 17 points. Houston's shooting guard James Harden scored 30 points, 6 rebounds and 5 assists. And now it's time for the weather updates. Well, that is all for now. For the latest updates, you can follow us on social media at Indus.News. Take care.